Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast. We continue our study of the Gospel of John. And again, good to have you with us, Mike. I enjoy hearing your thoughts as compared to mine and alongside mine, I guess I'd say, because again, we talk enough off air that we kind of know where we're going often. But the joy of this is talking literally to each other on the air with a cup of coffee and see where things end up. Today we're studying John 1, verses 19 to 28, our continuing study of the gospel verse by verse, starting in verse 19. I would like to get to the question, really it's introduced in 119, so I'm going to come back to it, as it were, after we go through the verses and talk about the concept of Christos or Messias or Mashiach in Hebrew. And what does it mean for Jesus to be called the Christ? And then we'll get to, this is important, in fact, let me give you an opening illustration for your perusal or your thought, Mike, that the word Christ, I would argue, will be a developmental term. And as such, think in terms of like if I had said 20 years ago, do Black Lives Matter? Yes. Do you want to make America great again? Yeah. But notice how over time they can become phrases that are tied to a political movement, right? So now people, when they see a MAGA hat, will react politically to a phrase which by itself can just mean, hey, let's be good. And so my recommendation in this podcast will be that Jesus as Messiah will be something that takes time to develop in the hearers' minds, and it will have a sense of meaning beyond just is Jesus an anointed figure, reminiscent of those anointed figures of the Old Testament. And again, that's not new news, but I think that's a good application of how phrases can build meaning. And even think in terms of where we're going to go in the text today, where John the Baptist is out baptizing people who come to him. Why are they doing that? Baptism, I'll argue, was a means, and probably I should save this for the conversation when we get there, that baptism is something that they were doing because of the culture where you'd physically show, kind of think of MAGA hats or, a BLM sign in your yard. You're signing up for a movement that is more than just the words, but the meaning behind the words or developed meaning behind those words. So that's where I'm going to go today. And, I don't know if I've given you enough to respond to yet, Mike, but that's my thoughts. So any thoughts you want to throw in before we get going?
I think, when you mention about the development of those phrases, those terms, how that, it's essentially ideology started developing. The word Christos has a lot of weight already. And especially if you were not Jewish, it already had like other connotations just from the culture, the mainstream culture of that time, right? Of being one of the nations under the tutelage or really the hand of Rome. That word itself had certain connotations. So to hear or to read John using that in relation to Jesus or in sort of adjacent to Jesus, because it's being asked to John the Baptist, that it becomes it's a little uneasy, tense moment.
Right.
And as you were talking, actually, I was thinking from just even something that was a little bit more innocuous for most people in the U.S., but not so much so for me as a Bostonian. There's a moment where I remember in one of these movies, I think it was Ocean's 12. It was years ago, but they have no commentary. It's like all silent track. It was just basically one of those like, oh, you're just seeing the action. There's no real words being said. But you see two of the characters, the actors in that movie. One guy is wearing a Boston Red Sox hat. Another guy is wearing a New York Yankees hat. And they sit across from each other and they both take off their baseball caps and place them right in front of one another.
Well, there you go.
And everyone else that's outside of New York and Boston are going to be completely confused of like, what the heck? Because right after they do that, they break out into a brawl. And start fighting on this very closed, basically bus, train like setting. And it is, they're basically causing a ruckus. But if you have no idea what the heck is going on with a Boston Red Sox hat owner and a New York Yankees hat owner, then you're just going to be confused. Like, why did they just start randomly fighting? They didn't even say anything to each other.
Yeah. Well, this will make no sense to anyone outside of your purview, I guess, again, or a Boston. Johnny Damon. Does that name ring a bell? You know, didn't he go from Boston to New York?
Yes. We don't like talking about it. It was that day was a painful day. Because,
even just saying the name Damon, all of a sudden it just arouses these emotions within you. And like I care, I'm from Minnesota, but yeah, it's fascinating.
For people who don't know, Johnny Damon was one of our Red Sox players, and he was actually termed our Jesus. Johnny Damon was Jesus because he grew his hair out long. He grew a beard. He basically had almost like this imagery of looking as though he was Jesus. Like, oh, he's going to be our savior for the Red Sox to finally win. Yeah. And the day that he, in the end, decided not to continue his career with the Sox and went right for the Yankees, all within the span of like 12 hours. And within that span, he went from having full on, hair down to his shoulders, full beard, mustache, everything, to all of a sudden being as clean cut as possible. Haircut, trimmed, he was completely clean shaven, and he was wearing the white and blue pinstripes. And he was right there, right on in front of all TV. So everyone in Boston, all my friends, all my coworkers, we were just it was so painful.
Well, that's and the point for the non-baseball person is you can be traded among teams. It happens all the time, but don't go from Boston to New York. It just doesn't work, or vice versa. You just don't.
Or at least not do it in that kind of fashion. Where we're like, okay, you have to go to New York. We get it. Give us some time. But when it was like within a span of 12 hours, he rejected our last offer and he took the Yankees. Like that moment was so hurtful that I knew friends who basically took their full on size, cardboard cutout of Johnny Damon as a Red Sox and they put it in their yard and just like burnt it. Because they were so upset.
With that, we can, and now the Bible makes sense, right? Now we're getting into the context of what it must have been like to hear Jesus being proclaimed as the Christ. Okay, so let's get into that and and use that as our cultural entrance into a story that's probably culturally odd to us. But I'm going to start in John 1:19. Now, this is the testimony of John. I'll be reading ESV version here. This is the testimony of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? Now, John, again, is a son of a priest, Zacharias and Elizabeth, remember, born in their old age. He thus, but he goes out into the wilderness and does not participate in temple life at all. He becomes this ascetic, just a different man from his calling that you'd think he would have had as a priest's son. And he is now in the wilderness baptizing. And this is not told in John. This is more in Luke and a little bit in Matthew, that he is baptizing people who want to change their outlook on life, ... And we'll get into what that outlook will be coming up. But this is the testimony of John when the Jews, now here in Greek, huiadoi, or weadoi, weados. The idea of a Jew is often thought of in terms of a geographical term, the ones living in Judea. In fact, that's how it's used. The Judeans is sometimes how the word is translated. So the challenge will be for figuring out who these Jews are in the book of John. In 5:16, they are persecuting Jesus. This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. In 7:1, because the Jews were seeking to kill Jesus. He didn't want to go there to Judea. So the point is that often in discussion of the book of John, the question of who are the Jews becomes front and center. Not to be anti-Semitic and not to be careless with the use of the word Jew. Most commentators have said what the writer is doing is grabbing a term, a general term, and putting into that term in his time period an antagonistic portion of the Jews who are going to be Jesus' enemy. So not all Jews, that's the main point to catch here. Not all Jews were against Jesus, but that's the way John will use the phrase, the Jews, okay?
And can I bring up just like how other translations try to resolve that kind of concern? The NIV here, they have a note on what they have here because they translate that as, now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was.
Okay.
And their footnote is the Greek term traditionally translated the Jews refers here and elsewhere in John's gospel to those Jewish leaders who oppose Jesus. And then they list out a whole bunch of verses throughout the entire gospel where they think this is where it's referring to the leadership of the Jews. And there's a secondary note where it'll also list out even more, like of where they're getting the concept that it's this particular faction of the
Right.
Judeans. And so thus they just simplify it as the Jewish leaders, because they're trying to make it clear this is not describing an entire ethnic group.
Yeah, well said. Get into their mind, get into their head, and it's the only way to read this. So thank you. The Jews sent priests and Levites, so they're going to send out leadership or leaders of the Jewish sect that they think they have the right to curtail how Jews should think. This leadership group, this subset of Jews, has the mindset that if there's someone out there who is going a different pattern or a different way within their Judaism, we have a right to at least ask them what they're up to. And that's exactly the question. Who are you? Which, again, presupposes that John has been at this for a while. He has amassed a following. People are, in fact, one synoptic says all Judea came to him. So it must have been a very large group of Jews and some Gentiles, we learned from Luke 3 as well, that are coming to John and wanting to physically show their, here we go, signing up for a movement that John was instigating and leading. And that signing up was done by getting into a patch of water. This is not in the Old Testament. So somewhere this comes into play between the Testaments, that people would join movements by getting into water and going under the water, coming back up again. And in so doing, you come up different than you went in. And everyone knew it. When you went to work the next day, people would say, hey, I saw you got baptized. Into what movement did you get baptized? Would probably have been the question that is being asked. So who are you? And here, John, this is in 1:20 and 21. John starts his answer by saying, I am not the Christ. In Greek, I am not ego eimi, uk, not. I'm negating the ego eimi. By the way, we're going to get to this later in John, where Jesus says, I am. And it has caused a lot of discussion about whether he's claiming the divine name. Be ready for both in the Septuagint of the Old and we'll get to this, the use of Greek in the New, that ego eimi is a very common stock phrase by all people, including Jesus. So it's not going to be, I'm going to argue it's not the tell-all that many people have thought it is when it comes to, claiming to be somehow a Yahweh level being. We'll just get to that when we get there. But anyway, John says, ego eimi, uk, I'm not ha Christos. I am not the Christ. Let's talk about that coming up, but for now, move along. What then are you, Elijah? Now again, this shows where they were in their mindset. The Jewish leadership had seen the Old Testament, the very end, Malachi 3 and 4, where in fact it's the last several verses of the last chapter of the last book, Malachi, where the role of Elijah was promised as coming before the great and terrible day of the Lord. The idea was in the mind of the Jew that if you read the Old Testament story carefully, God has various roles that he has. The first time a person comes in, like an Elijah, his role can be reprised. David's role can be reprised. The king of Israel, the David figure of Amos or Micah. He's dead and gone, but we can have another David, as it were. Well, Elijah, of course, is dead and gone by the time of Malachi, but the promise is, Malachi 4, that when God comes to earth in that last great day and settles all scores, he will do so only after he sends a precursor, a Elijah-like figure who will come in and warn people that Yahweh is about to do what he's going to do. And that's what's all bound up in that question. Are you Elijah? Are you Malachi 4? To which John says, I'm not. Are you the prophet? Well, that's the beginning of the story. That's probably Deuteronomy 18:15, where Moses, in his last speech, tells the people, there's coming beyond me or after me a prophet, a Navi, who is going to be Like me, he's going to have the words of God, and you must obey him. And so the word prophet in Deuteronomy is, again, 18:15, is often capitalized in our English versions because we see Jesus being that prophet to come. Fair enough, right? But the point is that, again, even in Jewish theology at this point, they had at least these three, and think of how all three of them kind of flow together: Christos, Elijah, and prophet. They are roles that were played in the Old Testament that are going to be reprised in the New, or in the eschaton, in the last days. And so the question, if we had never seen John 1:20 and 21, we could have, if we had known their daily newspaper and how they thought as a Jewish nation, we could have predicted these three. Hopefully we would have thought like this, that they were waiting for a Messiah, and in this sense, the Messiah. We'll talk about that. Elijah and prophet. All three of these, they're not necessarily one better than the other. That's key here. One is not necessarily better than the other, but they all are reprising a role that had been previously played in the Old Testament and was expected to happen in this new age, or the age to come. Okay. Anything there, Mike, you want to add? I
was also thinking about this goes back to another scholar I had mentioned before, George Athos. He wrote a reference work called Bridging the Testaments. And the context, at least the cultural context he brought up about this intertestamental time, was that, especially the Jewish leadership, they were not necessarily very friendly to the idea of the prophetic ministry still continuing in their midst. And because the prophetic ministry is also so connected to Messiah, to the kingdom of David being reestablished. And so there was a lot of risk for the Jewish leadership, because in some sense, their culture for several hundred years have gotten so used to being governed by the priests. But, the original role of the priests is they serve alongside of and serve in service of the king, the monarch of Israel. And so as long as you don't have a monarch who's a messianic, like the son of David, then the priests could essentially keep on running the show. And so, it's kind of interesting now that I have that in my mind, in my context now, when I see these questions, it isn't just an innocent, we have a genuine inquiry. It's also who are you? Because if you say yes to any of these things, you then become an immediate risk to us.
Very well said. Power. Yeah, that's a good point. That behind their question is not the hoped for yes that we often think of. It's almost a hope for no, because if he does say yes, they're in a sense seeing themselves in competition with John.
Yeah, and it's also interesting is that I know Jesus later on, this is well after John has died, that he will make clear to his own disciples that John was the Elijah. He was fulfilling that role of Elijah, but here John is saying he's not. Right. And so I almost kind of see this as that he was given enough information from the Father, however you want to describe it, so that he was not culpable.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. In fact,
the Father didn't tell him you're taking on Elijah's role. It's like, oh shoot.
Yeah. And that's a great point. And actually the next verse helps me think through that with you on that level. Because what if God, let's just do this. Let's go to 123 and then think backwards on to 122. John said, I am the voice. Okay, if I'm not the Christos, I'm not the prophet, I'm not the Elijah, not these roles. I am, he said, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. He's quoting their Septuagint of Isaiah 40, verse 3. I am, and then he just quotes. He pulls out of, I would call it thin air, Isaiah 40, verse 3, which is interesting because, and it'll bring us back to the other three roles. How did he know that? In other words, if I'm asked, who am I? I'm Ron, whatever. Well, yeah, but what role do you play in God's plan? Well, I'm not the prophet. I'm not Elijah. I'm not the Christ. Well, but here's what I am. And then he goes back and he grabs a phrase that's not even prophetic. It's a statement made by Isaiah, second Isaiah, if you want to call it that, where some people even think this is, because it's in plural, that this is a statement from the divine council. That this is God talking among others when he says, or Isaiah is this voice, of course, but there is a call being made out to a plural group of audiences, or a plural group of ears to hear this. And so my quick point is kind of dovetailing to where you are, what you're talking about. Was he Elijah? Jesus will later say, well, he was. If you had believed him, he was. And I think what that shows to me anyway is that John is just being an honest, trajectory living guy, where he's saying, here's where I am right now. From what I know, what God has shown me, and I would love to know how this happened, I know I am the one that is fulfilling the role of Isaiah 40. And Isaiah 40, of course, is often thought of, we call it second Isaiah, where now that the presumed return of Israel is in the mind of the author, whether it be the original Isaiah or a later Isaiah, an editor, the story of Isaiah 40 is, now that we have become faithful to our God, here's what Yahweh's going to do. And so that's what I think he's doing here. He's just saying, let me have the role for the moment of being the person, the voice, who is telling you that Yahweh's coming, and here's how to get ready for him. Especially if you're a righteous Yahwist, here's the joy you will have, in what's to come. If you're an enemy of Yahweh, and that's a key moment here that John is trying to show, that the very people standing in front of him are likely not Yahwists. That you really have to read it that way. Then look out, because the axe is laid at the root of the tree, as he says in Luke 3. He's about ready to cut you down. And I'll leave it there. But that's an interesting, like I say in 123, he does go back and grab a role that's not even prophetic, and he turns down the roles of three, shall we say, prophetic roles that people thought he might be.
Well, wouldn't it be fair to say that, again, it is coming from a prophetic word. It came from the prophet, Isaiah. It's just, how prophecy is fulfilled. It isn't a prediction. It's not often the case where it's a prediction and then, we see it actually be fulfilled. It's often more of the word of Yahweh being utilized, where you see a fuller sense later on of like, holy cow, this worked out. What's interesting is, because you did mention earlier that John, he went down a different life path. He's the son of a priest, but he went out into the wilderness. There is this interesting note from the Cultural Background Bible. Walton and Temperman were the main editors for it. And they have a little interesting note where they reference the Qumran community also used this verse to justify its location in the wilderness.
Okay.
John's use of it authentically fits its time and location. So it's, people have always speculated if John might have been influenced or may have had contact with the Qumran Essene community. And so it's an interesting thing. It's like it's in the air of the culture in that time. People were thinking of, especially because of Roman roads. Well, we're going to have something even better than Roman roads. We're going to have someone preparing the road for not Caesar, but for Yahweh. Very
good. Since you brought it up, I look at my library that's close to my, within arm's reach. And if a person wants to, I'm often asked what books or Bibles, to read. The Cultural Background Study Bible that you just referenced, that's the second book on my shelf. The first one's the Jewish Study Bible. The second one is the Cultural Background Study Bible. And then it's the IVP Bible Background Commentary, Old Testament, Bible Background Commentary, New Testament, the Lexham Geographic Commentary. In other words, the kind of commentaries I recommend, and I'm sure you would say the same, that I'd recommend to anyone who wants to get consistent DCW thinking in their Bible reading, is read Bible commentaries that have to do with the culture of that time period. Mm-hmm. Down the row of my Bibles, I have an ESV Study Bible, Zondervan Study Bible, so forth and so on. But those are more theological, right? An ESV Study Bible is going to concern itself and is written by, think of the editors behind an ESV Study Bible. These are mostly theologians. They're not cultural anthropologists. And what I like about, again, you mentioned it's Walton and Tremper Longman. These are theologians secondarily. They are mostly Bible scholars when it comes to the culture of the time period. And that's why I'm going off on a rabbit trail. But I would give my time and effort to reading Bible commentaries that are much more concerned about the culture of the period than about how to apply it to my life today. That's just me.
Yeah, I think we're trying to go back to biblical theology, which is, I liked how Dr. Heiser talked about it. He's very good at just digging down into one particular subject, right? And part of the role in biblical theology ultimately is to provide the information and the tools so that later folks who do more of like a theological retrieval or a systematizing of theology, they have the information to draw from that is accurate to help bring it together to make sense of it all.
You'll get there. In other words, if you use a cultural background study Bible, you'll get to the theology eventually, but you'll do it by the means of the culture of the period, which is, I think, much more careful. I'm ready for 124 and 25. Now, they had been sent from the Pharisees, so that's largely, again, that Jewish leadership that we're talking about. They asked him then, why are you baptizing? Again, all I want to say, this is not again, really key to our discussion today, but as a subject matter, I find it fascinating that here's something that was not happening in the Old Testament. So there's no Old Testament cultural background to draw from. You have to draw from intertestamental culture to figure out or ask the question, why were you going into water, going under the water and coming out? What's the significance of that moment? In my opinion, just for what it is, after, again, thinking through this over the years and reading along these lines, is that baptism was simply one of those cultural ways that people, it wasn't religious. This is just a cultural thing where people would do something to show that they were signing up for whatever the person was baptizing for. So whether it be in the Old Testament giving you a shoe or a sandal or giving you my signet ring or my staff, Genesis 38, that there are various ways that cultures have shown a way to make a promise or to sign up for something. We've talked through this, in the Genesis story. And now in culture, you didn't hand a sandal to John. You'd walk into water and John would baptize you. Jesus will be found in John at the end of 3 and beginning of 4, that Jesus is baptizing, or his disciples are. So Jesus will actually be, pulling people from John's movement into his own movement, and there'll be baptisms for Jesus, as it were. And of course, in Acts 19, you have baptism story of Paul coming into Ephesus and people being rebaptized into the name of Jesus and away from the name of John. So the point is, we have baptism in the New Testament. I do think it's a cultural issue, and just as easily, here's my shot over this bow, which I say gently, but here's where I am theologically. Just as baptism comes into the story of the New Testament, it goes out just as fast. And so Paul will be able to say to the Corinthians, I did not come to baptize. I'm not here to just culturally dunk people and have them sign up for the Jesus movement. I'm here for a full-on, life change, what it means to believe in Jesus and worship him as John 1:18 just said, the unique deity from the Father. If you give your life to that, whether I baptize you or not, it even says at the beginning of Corinthians 1, I don't remember who I baptized. It wasn't important to Paul. Baptism, so notwithstanding the Great Commission, Paul didn't think it was important to baptize. I really don't see it that way. And why? Because it was a cultural norm, and culture can come and go. And so today, here again, I'm getting in trouble, I suppose, by some of my Baptist friends. If you don't baptize people, I don't think it matters. What matters is worshiping Jesus. And if you're in a culture that baptizes, go ahead. If you're not in a culture that baptizes, I wouldn't worry about it. And boy, when I even hear myself say that, I'm undoing most of my seminary training because I was trained as a Baptist in a lot of my Well, so was Dr. Heiser. So anything you want to say there, Mike? I'm ready to drop the concept of baptism, but there's a lot of tradition built up around a word that, frankly, I think is just a cultural norm for that period.
So can I ask you? So I can ask you this, based on the local culture, right? Because I didn't grow up Baptist, but, I grew up in a Chinese heritage church where a lot of Chinese, Christians, especially from the 1900s, they were influenced by Baptist and Methodist theology because a lot of missionaries who came into China were also Baptists and Methodists. And so, so I have some familiarity with the concepts of it. But I guess, what if you were in a church culture where baptism was framed as an act of allegiance?
Yes, then I would do it.
Okay.
Yep.
Because I think in these years, right, working through and learning about DCW and just the culture of the time, I remember Matthew Bates's work on Saved by Allegiance Alone and his other works around that same theme. He came to the concept that baptism is, I think even the most recent book of his, Why the Gospel, was that baptism was your first act of allegiance.
Yes.
The beyond just simply, I mentally assent, but all right, if I have the chance and opportunity, yes. How do you display your loyalty?
Can I use the example? And maybe we've talked like this before, but since we're on baptism, let's go full bore for just 5 minutes here. Baptism to me is like a Mother's Day card on Mother's Day. Should I do it? Duh. If I don't give my mother a Mother's Day card, are you kidding me? That would be the greatest sign of disloyalty to my mother, that I would knowingly not give her a Mother's Day card. Okay. However, if I'm in jail and I can't get it to her, is she offended? No. And that's why you kind of threw in there, and I agree, if you can, right? And so baptism in that era was, do you want to go down and see John and sign up for this movement where he's expecting the Messiah at any point, and you better be loyal to Yahweh or you're in trouble? Absolutely. I'm going to head down there. And that's why I think many people went down, because there was an air of expectation. This is all part of the story of the New Testament, that God was up to something, even though Rome is in charge. There must have been, and John was a powerful witness of this, that Yahweh was on the march, and that if I wanted to join the movement called, I think, just Yahwism 101, I am going to be loyal to the God of Israel. That was enough for me to go down all the way to Judea, wherever I was from, and get baptized. However, if, again, I'm in prison, I can't get there, does my loyalty save me? Yes. Should I get to John? Yes. but I can see why some wouldn't and many did. Is that making sense?
Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up is also just that the early church Christians understood life happens, and right. There's even a document. Again, this probably won't make some certain camps of Baptists very happy, but there is a document called the Didact that was, that essentially has these laid out instructions of Christian leadership of if you're in this scenario, do this. If you're in that scenario, do that. And they had a section talking about baptism. And this document was basically found in the wilderness, desert, dry, arid places. And so it actually laid out, if you can, optimally, yes, go ahead. If there's plenty of water, then dunk the person. Right. They fully immerse them. Yay. Then, certain camps of Baptists are going to be happy. But it then goes on. But honestly, since we are in arid desert places, if all you have is enough for just a bowl of water, then putting your hand and dapping it on the person's forehead, that's fine. If all you can do is even just a little dip and just putting your finger on their forehead, that's fine. They understood, the practical reality is water is such a valuable commodity. We can't just let a person bathe in it.
So what I've found, and I love that story from the Didache, you're right. And from what I've found in our modern churches is that every church and every denomination, shall I say, has its own version of baptism. So depending on Lutheran, Catholic, Baptist, you're going to hear a different meaning behind that moment. And I'm saying, notice the difference and yet the similarity, that the ability of turning a symbol into a meaning is kind of up to how you take the story of the Bible. And so I'm going to know from a reformed version of the Bible why they baptize children. In other words, it's part of a continuing story that they're telling through this ritual. So that's fine. I'm just saying, notice, and every Christian should ask, why do we do this? And then, if you want to sign up and join that movement, that denominational understanding of baptism, go ahead. Again, I think the point is the the meaning of being a Christian supersedes baptism. It's bigger, right? And so, Paul will argue in Romans that we get baptized, Romans 6, but his point is much bigger than that, is that Jesus is the one through whom, loyalty comes, or loyalty to Jesus is what saves. And we all know that. So we're all, we're wrapping our minds around the same idea that baptism in the days of John, let's bring it back to him, was a means of physically showing loyalty to a movement in which Yahweh was on the march. And that's all I need to say at this point for this verse. And it'll be interesting how baptism again shows up in many portions of the biblical story, New Testament story. But it finds its basis here when John is signing people up for a movement. So,
if I can maybe just add one last thing, Ron, it's simply allegiance is embodied, right? It's more than just a simple "I agree with these facts" or these propositions. It's also embodied. It's going to be lived out. And so I find, however, I don't want our audience to think that if you have the option to be baptized, but you don't have to take the option. I guess I would push back on that. In the end, our allegiance is embodied, and there's something about ritual, as simple as it is, reinforces something within our own.
I may have told you this story before, but I end with this one then, because I'm totally agreeing with you. Remember the story I told about a guy who had a church in a storefront down here in Minneapolis? Did I ever tell that story? And I came to visit him one day, and I think I even preached there for him. And they had this is a storefront. This is part of an indoor mall, okay? And by the entrance, the sliding glass door was a old farm door. Kind of a thing, white, old door. Okay, did I ever tell you this story?
Actually, no, I don't think you have.
Okay, because it's great, and there were signatures all over this door. 50, 60 signatures. Okay, and I asked him, "What is that?" And he said, "Well, we don't have a baptismal here. We're just a kind of a startup church. So what I do," and he did this once when I was actually there in the service. He said, "If you want to become a Christian." And here it is. And he laid it out very clearly. And then he said, "What I would like you to do is, on the way out, sign that door and say, I want to be known as a Christian in my home, at work, at play. I want to be known as a believer. It's not just something I say." And he says, in other words, it was his baptism. And what was really cool, and either he told me about this or I saw it. I forget if I have it in my mind because I saw it or he told me, but there was a guy who was struggling with believing in the gospel over months at a time. I mean, he would come, but he was not sure. Finally, he saw, and I think he told me about this, so I'm going to put it in that light. He saw him go over to the door after church on one Sunday in particular, take the pen and stand there and stop and think. And then he took the cap off and signed the door and walked out. And I thought, that's gorgeous. That's exactly what that's what baptism would have been. Yeah. It's one thing to say, I believe. It's another thing to take the pen cap off and sign my name, right? So to me, that's always been a resonant idea. It resonates with me when it comes to what baptism means. It means I physically say yes to something that I mentally assent to as well. So
I find the beauty about that is that, ultimately the theme, I find, is that it needs to be yes, it's a moment, but it needs to be a moment where there was intense intentionality, and that years later you could look back. Yeah, I do follow this God.
Yeah.
And I will continue to follow this God. It's hard right now.
We all need those moments of decision making.
And that's was what I realized with my own baptism. One of my youth counselors kind of described it, that there will be moments in your future life as a Christian where you doubt, where you wonder, is this real? Is this worth continuing? And that one of the things for baptism, the benefit of doing something like that is because it's such a memorable event that you can at least say at that moment, at that time, oh yeah, I wanted to follow. I so knew I wanted to follow. can that help me in the current moment that I may be in?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
All right, good. Well, and let's just finish our text here. John answered them, I baptize with water, but among you stands one. He doesn't know, he hasn't met Jesus in the sense of the Messiah yet. I think he knows Jesus as a cousin, but he doesn't know that he is the Messiah. But among you stands one who you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. So it's just a promise of the conversations to be had about who Jesus will be. And of course, John, then after this moment, in fact, between 27 or 28 and 29, apparently he is baptized. Jesus is baptized by John. But well, let's go back to verse 20. Really, it's the beginning of our conversation this morning. And I want to end with it, end our time by talking through this concept of the Messiah and what it means. Because I think, again, Christians have packed New Testament meaning backwards into the Old to the point that it can be unhelpful. So that's what I'm concerned about. Here we go. John 1:21. I am not the Christ. Notice ha Christos in Greek is interesting because it's a phrase that does not occur in the Old Testament. So what I'm going to do is just talk through some points here. I'm going to number them for the sake of my own organization. And I welcome, again, your first take on how I am approaching the concept of a Messiah, okay? Number one, the idea of a Messiah or anointed one is common in the Old Testament. There are numerous, and these are my statements. I'm writing them to myself. I'm not quoting someone else, so take it that way. There are numerous anointed individuals who are called by God to do various deeds. Quite commonly, it's a king, can be a priest, can be a prophet. So being anointed with oil, Mashiach means to smear, literally, can just have a sense of being someone who is dedicated to a task, right? What's interesting is that none of these people in the Old Testament who are smeared with oil or anointed, none of them are worshipped. None of them are understood to be agents of personal salvation or individual righteousness. They're not deities. In other words, let's back up and kind of tone our expectation down that if I say someone's the Messiah, or back up, a Messiah in the Old Testament, they are not agents of salvation. They are not worshipped. They're not deities. In other words, we have to kind of back down our expectation of what this person is. And you know what? In most of the stories of the Old Testament, he's a normal guy who is simply abnormal in the sense that he's been tasked by the community or by God himself to do something. But again, the idea of saying something, that's enough. But I just want to kind of get that out into open air that what a Messiah isn't in the Old Testament is quite important before we get into what he is. Any thoughts there?
I mean, I think we can start there. I think that's how it was often taken in the text. I do wonder.
We'll
I think we're getting into that.
We have a ways to go, but that's a good start, I hope. All right. Now, number two, and this is interesting, the title, the Messiah, Ha Christos, is not found in the Old Testament, either in Hebrew, HaMashiach, or Greek, Ha Christos. Neither of them. So the Messiah is not a phrase that's in the Old Testament. While hope for a coming Messiah-like figure develops within the story. And you can think of Jeremiah 23, the branch, that someday this person will do such and such. That's good. It's there, but it's almost always, in fact, not through the use of the term Messiah in Hebrew. Isaiah 53, one of the greatest, obviously, texts of all time that we want to apply to Jesus, and I do. But guess what? The word Messiah never occurs in Isaiah 53. The servant does, but not Messiah. So I'm not picking on it. I'm just saying, let's, again, back off and say, there is a hope of a coming figure. Normally, we're not finding the word Messiah attached to it. Now, and we had talked off air about someone's commentary that you had recommended, and I said I had it, and we don't need to bring up his name. I find that here's my problem. Can I be honest, Mike? I find that Christian commentators package the word Messiah they put a capital M on it, and then they go back into the Old Testament too commonly for me, too easily for me, and say, see, there he is, there he is, there he is. And they start seeing these hints of, well, shall we call it a Messiah-like figure? And they admit, okay, the word Messiah isn't used there, but the concept of royalness or kingliness or being anointed for a task is there, and therefore they start to apply, shall we say, predictive elements to those things, to where I am expected as the Christian, if I was really reading my Bible carefully, so goes the presumption, I would see these predictive elements of a Messiah, and of course Jesus fulfills all those predictions. And that's where you get this idea, and I've heard this from the podium or the preachers along the way. There's like 345 prophecies of the Messiah, and Jesus fulfills all of them, and what's the chance of that? And that becomes this apologetic, like, what's the chance that Jesus could fulfill all these things? The challenge backwards is, I would say, and I have done this in my own head, every one of those 300 and some things, hardly any of them say Messiah, number one. Number two, they weren't predictions. They were true about someone, and yes, I can pull it out and turn it predictively into something else, but I just find, again, this is for my own use, the lack of benefit to going into the Old Testament sometimes with Christian eyes and foreseeing things that nobody on the ground would have seen the first time around. I'll leave it there, but do you see my burden?
I see your burden. I think also, like the communication agenda, like what your end goal ultimately, I think in the end, we can never get away, because we are followers of Jesus. We are we are Christians, that getting away from reading Old Testament scriptures through the lens or the mindset of being a Christian, we can never really get away from that. And, what we can do is to make sure we understand all of the fleshed out possible meanings of those verses. But I don't think we can ever escape that. I admire what you mean about, yes, the term Messiah is often used to describe certain people who were not, it was not predictive. But then there's also this beautiful thing about how, the New Testament writers and Jesus himself would say the scriptures was fulfilled in your hearing. And that has always left people confused. And so there's always this hint of like, there's a strata above. There was something that it was obscured. And I think even Dr. Heiser, he mentioned it in his books about how, well, of course, the plan for the Messiah would not be laid out super clearly, because then that would give the dark powers, that would give the devil, that would give all those who oppose the rulership of Yahweh, like too much of a clear plan of what's going on with this Messiah. It had to be obscured enough so that they would ultimately fall into the very hands of the Father, manipulating them into a way where they actually play into the salvation of all of humanity in the end.
Can I push back on your pushback, though?
Sure.
Thank you. And by the way, I've heard from people who listen to the podcast, they appreciate your pushback, and because they don't want two people always agreeing. So like that. But I'm going to push back on your pushback. So there's a book I've read in the hot tub at the Y. I really enjoyed it. It's called The Bible With and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently. Mm-hmm. The editors, or the two, Amy Jill Levine and Mark Zvi Bretler. I think that's the two. Yeah, that's the two authors. Yeah. Again, the title of the book, The Bible With and Without Jesus. It's a thick book, 400 pages. I'm going to push back on your point about reading the Bible Christologically and say, here's the problem, though. Unless we're able to read a book like that and appreciate the Jewish understanding of reading the Old Testament without Jesus, I think we're hurting our own argument. In other words, like they say, and we talked like this before, the way to argue with someone else or debate is to define their view to their liking and then take it apart. So until I define my opponent's view to his liking, and get his nod of approval, yes, that's exactly what I believe, then I really can't argue against it. And I would say the same with when it comes to Jesus. What I need to be able to do, this is my goal. I'm a Christian. I understand that. But my goal is to read a Jew and understand why he believes the way he does, exactly the way he does. So, by the way, I've been to Israel enough to meet this jeweler in downtown Jerusalem, in the old city. And we have long conversations about Jesus and Paul and stuff like that. He's a devout Orthodox Jew. Mm-hmm. And what I love about him, those times that we talked, is that he knows my position and I think I know his. And so we can argue lightly, or, my wife's off looking at jewelry and I'm behind the counter with him going at it about Jesus. And we're laughing yet concerned for each other on this level. Do you respect who Jesus is? And this is me, Mike. I guess I just say it again. Until I think like him, completely like him, I don't see how I can argue against him. And so that's why I think being a Christian who can think non-Christian thoughts is helpful. Does that make sense?
Well, if anything, your pushback is not really pushback to me, because I agree with you. Because it's,
I thought I was going to.
But what I guess if there was a pushback to my pushback, or at least fleshing out what I mean by my pushback, is that I absolutely agree with you that too often we, as especially, call us what we are Gentile Christians. Mm-hmm. We have neglected the Old Testament and the Jewishness of even the New Testament way of thinking.
Right.
And we've missed out on that. And that's, to me, is part of the beauty about DCW, is it's trying to take into account this element that oftentimes, especially with our Protestant heritage, it has been denigrated, mm-hmm. and not seen from a positive perspective, and not seen from, as you would like to often say, left to right reading, right? Mm-hmm. To me, though, the ultimate goal is not just only do left to right, but also right to left and center left, right, and to do just to dig and to just keep on fleshing out the beauty of this narrative and the scripture, right? And mm-hmm. and so, like, I find those conversations that you have, that's a beautiful thing, and I want to see that happen more and more often, because I would love one day that a person like that jeweler would be able to call Jesus.
I do too. And I don't want to bring up the name of the guy we talked about off air, because I didn't say it to you when you said it. Do you have so-and-so's book? And I don't want to denigrate his reputation, to anyone. I want everyone to read everything, right? The reason I reacted the way I did, or I didn't say what I could have said, was I didn't like the book, because he has Jesus in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3. I mean, every stone he's finding Jesus, and then he makes it like I need to agree with him, that if I don't see Jesus here, I'm denigrating his reputation. And I just would say, this is a general point then, that when someone doesn't see Jesus in an Old Testament passage, it's okay. It's okay. It's not as though they're hurting Jesus' reputation because they don't see him prefigured in the tabernacle, for example. And so what I don't like my books to do, and I'll argue with them right in the margins, I'll yell at them. If they're making the color of the royal blue, covering in the tabernacle to be prescient or predicting Jesus' royalty, I'll yell at them. I'll say, don't do that. Don't do that. Just stick with the story. If I get to, later see something where that's applicable, I guess I just, yeah.
Can I ask you this question? And, we can move on after this, but because of my doctoral degree, we've been presented with all these different ways of how do you preach from the Old Testament, and one of the main options was talked about is preach it Christocentrically. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, not with all the principles of how it's often formed, but when I noticed. And I've noticed that it seems to be coming from those who are from more Reformed camps.
Right.
And since you're kind of familiar with that background, I'm wondering, do you think that the Christocentric, or like maybe within Reformed theology, they're trying to find so much of the Old Testament being filled in Jesus that like somehow Jesus is such the fulfillment to such a point that you don't even really need the Old Testament anymore? You don't even have to really read it.
I'm sorry, that's what, who was the New Testament guy that said that? Basically, what the New Testament church father or commentator. Basically, Old Testament's not worth your time because it's revealed in the New. That's how we would say it. So, yeah, we probably need to get off that, but we've been there before. But yeah. Take those last 5 minutes for what they're worth. Know where we're coming from. All right, number 3 in my development of the title Christ. Okay, number 3 as I write it out for myself to read here. Number 3, Judaism developed 2 hopes during the intertestamental period. 1, an eschatological desire for Israel's political freedom and earthly bliss. That's not a problem. It's not wrong. This is simply developing between the testaments. A desire for Israel's political freedom, whether from Persia, Syria, Rome, doesn't matter. And earthly bliss, where you get to watch your children play on the street in front of you. That's the story of one of the later prophets. And 2, another hope coming out of the intertestamental period was the coming of a human Messiah who would win this freedom for Israel. That's where you get the Messiah starting to be used. It's the intertestamental period. It's not the Old Testament. It's the intertestamental period. That's why, again, reading stuff between the Testaments is almost as important as reading the Old Testament, because until you understand what they're saying, the New Testament, for example, will not make much sense. And so this, are you the Christ? That's answering a intertestamental question. It's not answering an Old Testament question. And again, this is important too. Neither of those hopes, whether it be for desire for political freedom or for the coming of a human Messiah, neither of those hopes involve the offer of a personal Savior, personal salvation, personal righteousness. Review how the DCW thinks in terms of personal righteousness. You go back to Genesis 15:6. Abraham loyaled himself to Yahweh and was considered righteous. That's how you get saved. That's how you get righteous. The coming of a Messiah will not adjust that. Okay? And I know that's quite a statement, but I'm going to park there and say, do you see where I'm going?
I see where you're going, though I know some people will be hitting a major speed bump right now.
Okay. Well, let's try to handle the speed bump. Here we go. Let me quote first from Joseph Fitzmyer. This is a good book. He doesn't take the view of the average reformer when it comes to if you're going to read Fitzmyer on the one who is to come, that's the name of the book, be ready to be frustrated unless you're willing to, this is my opinion. If you think with him, you won't be frustrated. If you get to the end of the book and hear people talk about what he just came up with without reading him, you will be frustrated. But this is one of his opening points in his introduction. A proper concern when it comes to Messianism would be to let the Old Testament use of Mashiach and its teaching about the continuing Davidic dynasty reveal their developing senses from the pre-exilic period to the exilic and the post-exilic periods of Palestinian Jewish history. Here it is, so that the reader can see how in the course of time, the concept of a Messiah as an awaited or future anointed agent of God in the narrow sense gradually emerged in Israel. And then how it was used in post-biblical or Old Testament, post-Old Testament Jewish writings in pre-Christian times, then how it was taken over by the early Christians who wrote the Christian scriptures. What Fitzmyer, he's a Catholic, what he's arguing for is, if we're careful, we're not going to go back and find the Messiah being this eschatological figure who's going to bring salvation, personal salvation to people. What you find is a concept of a anointed agent of God who over time gradually emerges as a figure that they can say intertestamental period now, the one to come, the one to come. And by the way, when John's in prison, this is in Matthew 11, Luke, is it 7? The parallel story. When John's imprisoned, remember what he sends messengers to Jesus and he says, are you the one to come? He doesn't use the word Messiah there. He just says the one to come, meaning wrap up, and here's where I'd argue the more you know, the better. Wrap up all those stories of the Old Testament, be it Messiah, servant, king, whatever, and summarize that into one person. If you could summarize all those words into one, what would you call it? Well, John didn't have a word for it, so he said the one to come. And that's where I want to go with this, is that Messiah is important, but it is superseded by this concept of a emerging one to come idea that really takes time to develop through the Old Testament, even to the point that it's an intertestamental discussion. Okay. Number 4 in my list, then, if you're following the trajectory of where I'm going, the purpose of John's gospel related to the second of these hopes, that is a personal Messiah. And we've talked about this previously, but in John 20, verse 31, these things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christos, the Son of God. When Peter talks in Acts 2, gives his first sermon, and Luke puts it into words that I think he's trying to form, this first sermon of Peter's to say, here is what he would have said again and again if he were given audience. Let all the house of Israel know that God has made Jesus Lord, Kurios, and Messiah, Christos, that he is now the Christos. And so that idea of all that has come before is now coming into one verse, as though Peter's saying, if you can sign the door on this one, if you can sign up and be baptized, and in fact, he even says, next thing, be baptized, because if you believe this, you're going to follow through, right? And the two things that he grabs onto are Kurios, Lord. I think that means, Lord of spirits. He's in charge of the heavenly world now by God's appointment. And number 2, he is the one to come. He is the one who we're going to call him Messiah, the anointed one. That is, he is everything the Old Testament has predicted when it comes to what God is up to in the story of his son. So, any thoughts before I give number 5?
What's interesting is that how Peter uses the house of Israel, which, it's not just the house of Judah, it's the house of all of Israel. And they've always had little divisions about who should ultimately lead us.
Yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't matter.
Should it be Ephraim? Should it be the house of Joseph? Or should it be the house of David or of Judah? Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting of just how, hey, house of Israel, all of us.
All right, number 5 is going to get me in trouble again. So here we go. Yet to be determined is in this development was the relationship of a person's belief that Jesus was the Messiah and that person's individual salvation. Asked directly, let's be right on point here. Did a person need to believe that Jesus was the Messiah in order to be saved? I think about that all the time when I'm dealing with my Jewish Orthodox friend in Jerusalem. Does a person need to believe that Jesus is the Messiah in order to be saved? And I know we say yes. I know my history. I know my theology in that sense. I've been taught it from grade 101, from kindergarten on up. You believe that Jesus is Messiah, you're in. Well, wait, let's talk about that a second, because there's enough. Well, let me give you my opinion. Before I give you my opinion, actually, let me give you some verses. If you type into Logos or Accordance, where does the word save or salvation occur in the same verse as Christos? Okay, there's my search. Save or salvation and Christos. It only shows up 4 times. 3 in Paul. In fact, they're all, 3 in Paul and 1 in Revelation. And really, think of it. This is 1 Thessalonians 5:9. God has not appointed us to wrath or destined us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus, Messiah. So there it is. Salvation is obtained through Lord Jesus, Messiah. Fair enough. 2 Timothy 2:10. Therefore I endure everything for the sake of the elect, that they may obtain the salvation that is in Christ Jesus with eternal glory. It's there. There's a connection between messiahship and salvation that's in the text. 2 Timothy 3:15, make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Again, the connection is there. I won't read Revelation 12:10. It's not no, it's there. I'm sorry. As I look at it, it is a powerful verse. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and power in the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah, his Christos, has come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down. So there is, again, salvation and Christ in the same, at least textually in the same verse. You can't prove a lot from statistics like that, but I often like to use our computers nowadays to ask, where does this word occur within so many verses or so many words of another word?
Can I bring up one interesting?
Go ahead.
Can I bring up one interesting kind of thing? I recently discovered this. I learned this because I had to teach a discipleship class in my church about, how did the New Testament canon form. One interesting thing that I discovered was a lot of scholars these days do believe that the Thessalonian letters, especially First Thessalonians, was probably the first letter, at least the first written down letter that we have from Paul.
Yeah.
And then if we do believe that Paul is ultimately the writer, the source of the Second Timothy, the pastoral letters, then this is near the end of his life. So from the beginning
first
of
and
his
last, interesting point.
Yeah, so from the beginning of his ministry toward the end of his ministry, he's talking about salvation and Jesus Messiah, Jesus Christos being, connected. So it's almost kind of an interesting thing. It's like, eventually the Pauline letters would get distributed because people thought, oh, this is really helpful. and it started going around the whole entire known Roman world. So at the beginning of his written ministry and then at the end of his written ministry.
Good point. There's a couple other passages that I thought I'd show that, the early preaching of the church did say that Jesus was the Christ, Acts 5:42. They did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. So it seems to be Acts 8:5, Acts 8:12, 9:22. These are verses where, again, Paul is out there to tell people he is the Messiah. So I don't want to denigrate the preaching of the early church and even the texts where Christ and salvation are in the same context. But what I'm asking, back to my question, did you need to believe that in order to be saved? And let me give you my opinion for time here. Oh, by the way, one stop before I give you my opinion. If you go through Romans, and I think you can do this with Galatians and other books as well, it's interesting how many ways you can talk about getting saved. For the sake of Romans 10, 9, and 10, one of the more famous verses, obviously, is that you believe with your heart that God, I thought I had it here. I'm showing it on the screen. If you believe, it's right there in Romans 10, 9, and 10. If you believe in your heart that, talk about filling in a blank, right? If you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. There's one way of describing salvation that it doesn't get into messiahship as much as, well, do you believe he raised him from the dead? Maybe that has, connotations of messiahship, but clearly Paul could have said, if you believe he's the Messiah, and he doesn't say it there. That's what I'm saying. So, well,
he also mentions the and also comes with the other part, which is the confession. Do you confess?
Exactly. Oh, yeah.
Jesus
I think getting
is
into the waters of baptism
Lord.
Would have been included there. Yeah. So let me give you my opinion for time. We're getting close to the end. My personal opinion is that belief in Jesus as the Christ was the chosen litmus test offered to Jews and pagans as the primary means of determining a person's ultimate loyalty to Yahweh. Now that's a mouthful. But what I mean is this belief, he's the Messiah, did not cause salvation as much as it evidenced commitment to Yahweh and the story that he was telling, especially in the sending of his beloved Son. In other words, if I said Jesus is the Messiah, what you would take that to mean is, well, then you sign up for the story that Yahweh's telling. He has been the Old Testament creator. He has been, he chose Abraham, and now he sent Jesus, and we killed him, and yet he ascended him. He resurrected and sent him. In other words, if I buy into that story, part of that story is he is the Messiah. He is the one to come, and he is the one who has come, and now he's ascended. And I'm signing up for that whole story by that quick, kind of like my opening point about, make America great again. I can tell you what side of a political argument I'm on by what baseball cap I'm wearing. Does it say MAGA or not, right? And I think that's what they were doing in the early church. They were noticing that the litmus test of those who were loyal to Yahweh was those who signed up for the understanding and even got baptized, saying Jesus is the Messiah. How's that sound?
So Ron, would it be fair to say, right, you're emphasizing, it sounds like to me that you're emphasizing a lot of, we need to understand what's going on during the Second Temple period. We have to understand what's going on with the intertestamental period, right? Because the word Messiah begins, like it, just from Old Testament scriptures themselves, they're talking about particular people, particular persons in a very specified context. But by the time we get to the Second Temple period, to the intertestamental period, and then once we get to the New Testament writers, the word Messiah starts really becoming like an umbrella phrase or term that incorporates essentially what John tries to describe, the one who is to come.
Yep.
And just takes it on that by the point we get to Paul, it's Christos. It's incorporating all this together.
And even Christians, people who follow the Christ, now we're even known by that term. And that's a phrase used in 2 verses in the New Testament. I'm a Christian in the sense that I believe Jesus is the Christ. Yeah.
Well, which it's by itself is a crazy concept, because it's a Greek term you often used before for the Caesars, and somehow culturally amongst the Greek pagans, they started using a term that meant to refer to a Caesar to also now referring to this weird sect of like Jewish and pagan Gentile people who follow a guy that died on a cross.
You're catching my drift completely. So thank you. Can I give you an example? This, I think, clears up for me anyway what often confuses people, or has confused the historian. Josephus, again, he's a Jew who converts to the Roman side and writes the history of the Jews as though, he knows Judaism well, but he's writing for a Roman audience in Rome. And one of those phrases that's in his book, or, that's in his Antiquities of the Jews, that there's no evidence this was added by Christians. But people have often said that must be an interpolation. Someone must have stuck it in there, is the phrase, he was the Christ. Again, here's the fuller sentence. He, Jesus, won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who had him come to him love did not cease. And he tells the story of the crucifixion of Jesus and so forth. Well, I think the answer there is that, notice that for Josephus, he could say he's the Messiah, and then in the same breath, under his breath, say, big deal. Doesn't mean I believe in him. It doesn't mean I'm signing up for the movement. I never signed up for that movement. That's what he's saying in between the lines here. Mm-hmm. He was the Messiah, so I didn't sign up for that movement. I went the way of Rome. I am now a loyal Roman subject. So he didn't want to be a Christian, and he could say he was the Messiah, but he didn't sign up. See the difference? Well, I don't see why that's not a considered question in the study of Josephus.
And even specifically towards the end of what you have here, he calls it, and the tribe of the Christians.
Exactly.
So it's like I'm not part of this tribe. I'm not part of this sect or this group. Don't identify me with them.
So my question's being answered in my mind. I say, did he believe Jesus was the Messiah, the one to come? Josephus would say, sure, yeah, he was, but I don't trust him. I don't trust in that story. I trust in the gods of Rome. They're the ones that I trust in now. So I think you could say he's the Christ and not be a Christian. The same with the centurion. We've often wondered about this. In the 3 synoptics, truly this was the Son of God, the centurion says. And we think, boy, that guy got saved that day. I don't think so. I think he's just admitting, like he does in the Luke version, this man was righteous or he's innocent, depending on the version. All he's saying is, I think he's the guy that he claimed to be, but I don't care. I'm a Roman. I have my own deities. I've got Zeus and Hermes and whatever. Why would I want him? He's the Jewish Messiah. Fine. He's going to save the Jews. He's not saving me. That's what I think is behind that phrase. And so we, again, don't read into, do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? If you do, you're saved. I don't think that's what the New Testament is saying. What it's saying is, you don't get saved in the story we're telling unless you believe that Yahweh is doing with Jesus what he said he would do. And that's where I think people could step off the boat. Even though they believed it, they could step away from the baptismal moment and say, I'm not going to give myself to it. So back to that Romans 10:9 and 10. There it is. Confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. Believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. And then you get into that confession. And I think part of that was for, again, the Pauline group there in Rome. Notice how the context for, this is in verse 13, I think, for there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call upon him, whether you're Jew or Gentile. You've got to make this belief that Yahweh is doing with Jesus what he claimed to do. That would include messiahship, but it wouldn't be limited to just calling the term he was the Messiah. All right, I'm all done. So what do you think?
I find it also very interesting that the very last part of that passage in Romans you're showing is, it says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's like I think it's a deliberate callback to Genesis.
Absolutely. 15:6 and on. Yeah.
Of those that people started calling upon the name of Yahweh. And
so, yeah, let's close with this for time, that because we're getting right back into it next podcast. We can get to John 1:29. The way to get saved in that day was, and if you had an elevator speech, or you got 3 seconds to yell, and as the door closes on the elevator, what do you tell the people to get, to do? You can find statements in Acts 2 and Acts 3 and Romans 10 and things like that. I don't think the way to figure this out is to collate all these different things and see where they're common or they're, saying the same thing. It's to know the culture from which people were coming out into a belief in Jesus as Lord. What did they have to give up and what did they have to believe? If you figure that out, now you know what the elevator speech would be. And that is, I think, believe that Yahweh is the creator of all things, and he has sent his beloved son to fulfill the story of Israel. Do you buy that? In other words, that's a huge ask. But I think that's what Paul was finding in Lydia. God opened her heart to these things. That the story that Yahweh was telling was compelling to various people, and that's the people, like a Cornelius, right? Even a Gentile would come upon this story and say, I've signed up for Yahweh. I believe in him, but what about Jesus? Oh, he sent him. Okay. In other words, they signed up for the story as they understood it. They were already righteous, but they signed up for it as they understood it developed. So I think with that, we'll be done for time, and we're going to keep talking about it next time anyway. So any last thought before I don't want to talk over your final thoughts, Mike?
No, I do think that it's a very interesting thing just to see how this idea of Messiahship, you cannot get away from avoiding the Second Temple material. You can't avoid the intertestamental. You have to actually understand how the phrasing and the culture and the mindset, or as Dr. Heiser liked to always say, the matrix of ideas developed. And
the mental furniture. I like that term too.
And just how it's all set in the minds of folks like Paul and John. And why is it that they can say all these things and it still made sense to them?
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Mike. And we'll drop it here. And God bless everyone. We'll talk to you next time.